Welcome to OMI Life. In this second installment, Father Austin Cooper speaks about his experiences of Vatican II, setting up St. Mary's Seminary in Mulgrave, the beginnings of the Catholic Theological College and the many changes in the Church during his lifetime.
So, when you were ordained some 65 years ago in 1956, Pope Pius XII was the Pope. Since then we've had 6 popes. You were ordained in the Latin Rite, the Old Rite. There has been an ecumenical council, Vatican II, which has had an enormous impact on the Church. Personally, I wasn't born. And here in the Australian province, 2/3 of the province wasn't born when Vatican II occurred. So I guess I would like you to share a little bit about what was it like living through the experience of Vatican II?
Okay, well, Vatican II really was, of course, an extraordinary event in the life of the Church. I'm very pleased to have been able to live through it. At the time, I was, of course, at St. Mary's, and I was also doing some teaching at Monash. I was a part-time member of the history department at Monash. And when the great decrees of the Vatican Council would come out, often they were talked about at morning tea in the common room of the history department. And one of my colleagues in the history department, Bill Kent, who later became Professor Bill Kent, and one of the world's great authorities on the Renaissance period, he seemed to know all about what was happening at Vatican II, so he and his enthusiasm sort of challenged me to keep up with all of these great documents. But I suppose in terms of 2 things, I suppose. First of all, I suppose the great change that happened really was the liturgy, wasn't it? That was the thing that most people felt most immediately and visibly in their parish or local community. So at St. Mary's we had the chance to, try to keep what was best about the old rite, the great sense of reverence of a great mystery, and that something so important and so essential was happening, yet at the same time it was happening now in a familiar language, now facing people and so on. So there was a challenge really then to make sure that one actually said the prayers in such a way that they were not just being said devoutly, but were being said in such a way that they could also be prayed by the people who were there. So you not only had the responsibility of trying to be faithful and devout, but you're also at the same time teaching or leading other people in the experience of prayer. And I think that was, a great challenge for a lot of priests. But somebody said to me once that she thought that most priests actually seem to manage that very well.
Okay. Okay. So it's well over 50 years since the closure of the council. What change hasn't happened that you had hoped would have occurred, and maybe still there is a hope that might happen, because it is only 50 years since the council?
Yes, well, don't forget that the council did take place at a particular time, the early 60s, and of course at the same time as the 60s wore on, they became one of the great dynamic changes in modern culture, didn't they? I suppose, people might time postmodernism from the period of the 1960s. After all, there were student riots. These were even happening at Monash. Monash was the sort of epicentre of student volatility in Australia, I think, certainly in Melbourne during the 1960s. And so they were very, in many ways challenging and troublesome times. And then there were things like Woodstock, so the world was changing rapidly. So while Vatican II brought the Church into the modern world, in a sense the modern world was changing very rapidly. And I think that one of the things that hasn't happened is that we thought that now, with Vatican II, the faith would be more readily appealing and more readily teachable, if you like, to people. And of course that hasn't largely happened, has it, I think? Well, the very fact that fewer and fewer people are even declaring themselves to be Christians, let alone actually practicing the faith. So I think while we've got the riches of Vatican II, and we should treasure them, we now are faced with the challenge, okay, well, getting this message across. That's still a major problem, isn't it?
Definitely. That's definitely. As a historian, is there anything that we can learn about the effects of Vatican II and the change and change in the Catholic Church? You know, looking at it from a long view of history.
Yes, well, I think every council, in its own way, does sort of, get the Teutonic plates to change a good deal. You know, there's a great deal of questioning going on and a great deal of change, and one just thinks of the traumas after Vatican I. You know, so many people were questioning about the extent to which the Pope's infallibility really did impact on the Church. There was one great English writer, W.G. Ward, a convert from Anglicanism, about the same time as St. John Henry Newman, by the way. And he said that he wanted an infallible statement every morning with his copy of the Times. Well, you know, that really was not what most Catholics either wanted or expected, and it certainly wasn't what eventuated. But a whole lot of people read that into that sort of excessive authoritarianism, read it into the whole sort of fabric of church life. Indeed, one of my great heroes, and he remains a hero despite this moment of foolishness, Gladstone, who had been 4 times Prime Minister of Great Britain and a great, great Christian man and a great Christian statesman. He was out of office at the time, and when he was out of office, he decided that, the Pope was really aiming at world domination. Well, that really was a fantasy of a major kind, you know. And he was led to that by sort of excessive statements by people like W.G. Ward, and also the greatest historian of the day, who was a good friend of his, a German historian. So, there was a lot of questioning and a lot of anxiety. When we look back at it, one wonders what all the fuss was about, because we've learned that, no, the Pope doesn't keep interfering, in church life to the extent of sort of discovering new things to impose upon us. That's not at all what it's about. It's about explicating or making clear the tradition in which we belong. So the Pope's not an arbitrary inventor of new doctrines. He's one who clarifies what has been the developing understanding of the Church.
So during this time, you're a young priest, newly ordained, you're trying to start the first house of formation apart from our novitiate here in Australia. Take us through a little bit of what was happening at 649 Burke Road, or were we there yet, or were we at Lemon Lodge? Where were you?
649 Burke Road.
649, 62 to 94 Jackson's Road. Yes. Sorry, 62 to 94 Jackson's Road. Beg your pardon.
Yeah, so good. I thought I was getting my geography. Right. No, look, well, yes, the building was underway, but it wasn't ready for us at the beginning of the school year. So that means that the 6 students that we had, 2 to begin theology came back from South Africa, and they went immediately to Corpus Christi College, Glen Waverley, and they lived there and they started theology there. The 4 who were beginning their seminary training and beginning philosophy, we had to take them down to Geelong for to our juniorate. So I think there were about 15 or 20 juniors there at the time, and then the 4 scholastics and Father Pat Slattery and myself, who were their mentors and teachers, we went down with them. So we were there until August the 4th, when we came up to Jackson Road. So really, in a sense, our first year was a very broken year, and it wasn't really possible to put very much in place until the next year. So one of the things that I was very keen about doing was to, first of all, to inherit and to put into practice what one has in the oblate tradition of seminaries and also in the Catholic tradition of seminaries. So there was a whole lot of things that we had to try to do. And of course, seminaries themselves were undergoing, a good deal of questioning and turmoil and so on at that time. So when we did get underway at St Mary's, there were certain things that I was very keen to do. I think, first of all, to make it a good oblate community. That's what it basically had to be and was. And so we tried to do that. It's very difficult to know how far one succeeds in doing that. It's up to each individual, isn't it, to sort of pull their weight and so on. What I could do as leader of the community, I suppose, was to try and encourage people to see it like that, to see it as a real community. But also, in the sense of learning, I was interested in, well, I suppose two parts of the building, particularly the chapel, which I tried to make as devout and as devotional and as simple as possible. But I hoped that it had a sense of warmth about it and obviously, inheriting something of the Catholic tradition of devotion, but at the same time being adaptable to contemporary trends in liturgy. So that was the challenge, but I hope we managed it. I think some modern churches built in the 1950s and 60s tended to be almost too bland, but however, that's another matter. The other thing that I tried to do, of course, as you know well, was to build up the library. And I think there we did, tangibly have a great deal of success. So those were two things on the home front. On the front of learning, one of the things that I also wanted to do was to, take the Catholic and oblate tradition about seminary formation. We had to actually accept that, but I firmly believe we had to read it in the Australian context. So the way I read it, now people better informed and might well disagree with me, but I think that there was a large measure of flexibility when it came to adapting that to Australian conditions. And I took the flexibility to the extent that I combined a traditional teaching of philosophy in preparation for theology with doing a university degree at Monash. So as many of our students as could, and that was almost all of them, in those days we had between 15 and 20 usually, after St Mary's got going after a couple of years. So I tried to get them all to do a degree at Monash. As I mentioned earlier, I was doing some teaching at Monash, and I also did my doctorate at Monash also at the same time. So, we did have a close relationship with Monash, and it continued after my time. Father John Marr, who was a philosopher, he also did some teaching at Monash. So we've, had quite a good connection with Monash. Mm-hmm. And quite a few of our people have degrees from there.
Mm-hmm. So a significant part of your ministry has been higher education, and you're invited as a very young priest, probably around this time, to be the founding master of Catholic Theological College. So maybe if you'd like
I wasn't
to share
invited to be the founding master so much as I was invited to be the chairperson of a committee which Archbishop, later Cardinal Knox, set up in 1967 to discuss the possibility of houses of formation or houses of theology coming together to form a unified teaching body. So that met every month from 1967 onwards, but CTC didn't begin actually until 1972.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was a good deal of period, and many of the religious orders, as you know, decided not to join. The proposal put forward by Archbishop Knox they formed the Yarra Theological Union, whereas ourselves and the Salesians, and also two smaller groups, the Maltese Paulists and the Missionaries of St Paul, the publication people, they decided also to join CTC. But it was predominantly the Diocesan Seminary, which at that stage, I think in our first year at Clayton, when the CTC got its own premises, I think there were 120 diocesan seminarians. Wow. And I think that between the Salesians and Oblates and the others, there might have been another 40. So, you know, and it was also opened, of course, to lay people. Though at the beginning, we had a very small cohort of lay people. YTU was much more vigorous in that aspect than we were, but that has grown over the years to be a very successful, well, indeed, the major part of our teaching body, student body are lay folk now.
So when it did open up in 72, you were the first master.
I was indeed elected the first master, yeah.
Were you also the rector at the seminary, or at that stage?
I was just finishing as rector of St Mary's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it was Don Hughes the rector.
Don Hughes took
up. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and so
yeah. There might have been a bit of a lap over. I just can't remember that actually, but it would only have been a matter of months.
Yeah, but certainly it was a full-time job then, as it is now.
Yes, it was really, yes. Yeah. And for the first year, the history of St Mary's repeating itself, our building wasn't ready at Clayton, so we actually taught at Glen Waverley, what is now Police Academy.
Okay.
So that was where CTC was for the first year. Then in its second year, we moved over to Clayton.
Okay. So you've been an amazing educator.
Well, I don't know about that, but I've been a
long-standing one. A long-standing but an amazing educator. And it's obvious that you're passionate about not only teaching but learning, because to be a good teacher you need to be a good learner. You know, even in recent times you were talking to me about changing the way in which you're teaching to improve your method of teaching. I just think that's amazing. After so many years of teaching, continually thinking about getting better in your practices. What inspired you? What gave you the passion that you have for learning? Was there a particular person? Is there a particular thing that gave you this passion and love of learning, which then translates to teaching?
Yes, well, look, I suppose, I think about anything that you've got, if you're really interested in it, there's only one way to be interested in it, and that is to, you know, be excited about it and enthusiastic about it. I think that's true of the faith, and I mentioned that earlier. But I also think it's true about any aspect of the faith that you take up. You mentioned, you know, I've taught history. I remember when I was first going to teach church history, I was actually at a meeting of historians at Melbourne University, and the professor of history at the Presbyterian Theological College, Ormond College as it then was, he was at the meeting, George Yule, and he was a great historian, and as well as teaching in the history department at Melbourne, he also taught church history at Ormond College. And I said to George Yule, I was driving him home, I said, George, you know, what do you aim at specifically in teaching church history? And he said to me, oh, it's simple. I just teach them the faith. And I thought, golly, how true. You know, that when we teach the story of the church, we're actually teaching people how the faith has been taught and lived. And sometimes there's been a dramatic gap between the teaching and the living. But it's a very exciting story. And actually we live out of that. We're living in it. We're a part of it. And so you can't sort of be introduced to it without being passionate about it. And I suppose just the general history thing, I suppose I got that from my teacher of history at Kilmore all those years ago, Brother Evangelist, who was a great history teacher. Yeah.
Excellent. Certainly, Austin, with all the changes that were occurring with Vatican II and in that period, I really admire priests that lived through such a momentous change and have remained faithful while many walked away. In some ways, you joined a church, were formed in this particular style of church, and sometime after were ordained in this type of church, and then without a great deal of notice, a lot changed and it became a new church. Mm-hmm. What was the biggest challenge of that change that you had to face personally, and what helped you face the challenge?
Yeah, well, I don't know about it being a new church. I think it was the old church developing, wasn't it? And look, I think, I suppose I get this from being a historian, that you can't have any change without having continuity. You've got to have some continuity, otherwise you just have a shambles. And I don't think, I don't think we had a shambles quite. Sometimes it might have appeared that way, and it might have appeared very confusing. But there were enough major things. I mean, there were the great truths of religion that were there and still there. The incarnation stands at the centrepiece, and through that we know about our life in the Blessed Trinity. And our challenge is not so much accepting that's always a challenge of faith, of course, but our challenge is how do we say that, how do we preach that to the people that we serve. Mm-hmm. That's where I think change comes in our deepening understanding, our trying to put things into new frameworks, new ways of expressing it, but it's still the old truths are still abiding there. They're not going away. They might be developing, and there have been some, quite interesting developments when you think about it. I said recently to somebody who said to me, that he'd been sick. I said, if I'd known, I would have come and anointed you. Oh, he said, I wasn't that sick. And I thought, well, we need to catch up. It's now not just anointing of people who are, it's the thing you do just before you call the undertaker. Mm-hmm. It's not that sort of thing. It's now, anointing for people who are sick. And so, but this development takes place gently out of what's already there. And I think it takes some people a while to catch up and to adapt to a different way of seeing things, don't you think? Mm. Yeah. So I suppose as a historian, I'm very conscious of the continuities. I think that they're very much there, and always will be. The thing is, well, how are we going to express them? How are we going to adapt them to changing situations? Times
and situations. Yeah. So we talk about being in a postmodern world, and we talk about being in a post-Vatican II church, and we talk about being in a communication-saturated world. And now, on a more sensitive issue, we talk about being in a post-Royal Commission church. And there's been lots of Royal Commissions in recent times, but we don't even have to mention the Royal Commission. Without a doubt, the Royal Commission to institutional response to child sexual abuse in Australia has changed the way we think about child protection and safety in organisational settings and institutions. The Provincial Council today are often dealing with cases with alleged abusers and situations with people that are no longer alive, and in many cases where the Provincial and Council weren't even alive for themselves. Yeah. At times, we're almost given this sense or led to believe that it was an open secret, that everyone knew what was going on, but nothing was being done. How have you responded, or how would you respond to that sense that sometimes we're given around this sensitive issue?
Yes, well, that it was an open secret. Look, I'm very sure that it wasn't. Well, if it was, nobody told me. And I just feel that it struck all of us like a bombshell, really, didn't it? And even I know that there were some priests that I knew, priests that I had supplied for, in their parish. And I actually, in the early days, I just said, I just can't believe that this is so about these people. Well, unfortunately, it proved that it was so. So, I had no suspicion at all of this happening in some of those cases, or in any of those cases that I was, of people that later were proved to be guilty, and very seriously guilty. I had no idea that this was going on. And I once said, just commented to a student of mine who, and I won't name him, but he happened to have been a member of Parliament, and he knew one of these priests, quite well. And I said, look, I had no idea. And he said, well, I had no idea either. And he said, how could you have any idea? He said, I just thought that, he was the local parish priest and a hard-working one.
Yeah.
And this local MP, who was not a Catholic, had worked quite well, with him. So, people really were very, very stunned. And it certainly has done a major amount of damage to the whole cause of church, priesthood, Christianity generally, hasn't it?
And how are you managing to deal with the shame and those challenges and the bombshell living in this post-Royal Commission church?
Well, yes, you don't expect any more, and I never did sort of expect, much respect for clergy, though we did get a lot, particularly from Catholic people. I now think we're forced to stand on our own as individuals and prove our own worth, and that's no harm, because that's all that we've got to go on, isn't it, really? If I can't be a decent human being and a committed Christian and a faithful priest, well then, there's a real problem for me, isn't there? So I think we're forced back into proving our human, Christian and priestly credentials, if you like, and we just can't assume that other people are going to assume that we've got them. So, and that keeps us very, very humble, I think. And we can't rely on this collar or anything like that. In fact, I normally feel, quite comfortable wearing collar and tie or whatever.
And I guess that leads into my next question. Is there any advice you give to younger people in the church around this challenge or this that we're facing?
Yes, well, I think that it forces us back to what we're really focused on, and that is the person of Christ and the Spirit of Christ, who actually says that we are his temples. That somehow or other we carry with us the reality and the presence of God, and somehow or other we have to be godly people. As St. Irenaeus, the great father of the church, said, we are made in the image of God. We have to grow into a likeness of God. We're a work in progress. And we have to be humble about our own spiritual journey that we're still on, struggling and, battling on. We have to be conscious about that. But at the same time, the grace of God is with us in that task. So I think there's a great reason to be confident about the gifts of grace that we're offered, rather more than the sort of social status that we might have had at one stage.
Thank you.